Most people think business wars are fought in boardrooms. They're not. They're fought in hearts, habits, and the taste buds of millions. For over a century, two companies have battled for global dominance, not just in sales, but in symbolism. Coca-Cola and Pepsi. One represented nostalgia, tradition, and comfort. The other stood for youth, rebellion, and change. And for one brief, explosive moment in history, the underdog outsmarted the empire. This is the untold story of the Cola Wars, how Pepsi used psychology, culture, and a single bold experiment to shake the world's most powerful brand. And by the end, you'll see why the war never really ended. At the start of the 20th century, Coca-Cola wasn't just a drink, it was America. Born in Atlanta in 1886, it began as a medicinal tonic, a mix of sugar, caffeine, and coca leaves sold in apothecaries. But as the US industrialized, Coke evolved from a curiosity into a cultural icon. Its advertising didn't sell flavor, it sold feeling. A smiling Santa, a family at the dinner table, soldiers sharing a Coke during war. The brand became synonymous with happiness, home, and the American dream. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola ruled the world. Its distribution reached nearly every country. Even US presidents were photographed drinking it. To drink Coke was to belong. And Pepsi? Pepsi was the shadow forever chasing the red giant. Pepsi's story began with bankruptcy. Twice. The company nearly disappeared in the Great Depression until one decision changed everything: size. In 1934, while Coca-Cola sold 6.5 ounces for 5 cents, Pepsi offered 12 ounces for the same price. It was the first time consumers felt like they were getting more for their money. The slogan said it all. Twice as much for a nickel, too. Sales exploded. Pepsi had discovered a new weapon: perception. It wasn't about being better. It was about being smarter. But by the 1960s, Coca-Cola was still the king. So Pepsi needed to evolve again. This time, they wouldn't just fight with price. They would fight with identity. In 1963, Pepsi launched one of the boldest campaigns in marketing history, the Pepsi Generation. Instead of appealing to tradition, they appealed to youth. The message was simple. Coke was your parents' drink. Pepsi was yours. Bright colors, upbeat music, and smiling young faces filled TV screens. The world was changing: civil rights, rock and roll, moon landings, and Pepsi was changing with it. For the first time, Coke looked old. It was a psychological coup. Pepsi had transformed from a cheaper alternative into a symbol of modernity. The Cola Wars had officially begun. By the late 1970s, Pepsi's boldness reached new heights. They launched an experiment that would become legend: the Pepsi Challenge. The idea was genius in its simplicity. They set up tables in malls and parks across America. 2 unmarked cups, one filled with Coca-Cola, the other with Pepsi. Participants tasted both, then chose their favorite. And to everyone's surprise, most preferred Pepsi. Cameras captured their reactions: the shock, the smiles, the disbelief. Pepsi turned those moments into ads seen by millions. "You picked Pepsi," the narrator said. "Isn't it time you asked for it by name?" It was a marketing masterstroke. Pepsi wasn't just telling people it was better. It was proving it, live. And for the first time in history, Coca-Cola looked vulnerable. Inside Coca-Cola headquarters, panic set in. Their confidence, their myth had been shaken. And that's when they made the biggest mistake in corporate history. By 1980, Coca-Cola had dominated the global soft drink market for nearly a century. But inside the company, executives were nervous. Pepsi was gaining ground, especially among younger consumers. And that simple mall experiment, the Pepsi Challenge, had become a cultural phenomenon. In taste tests across America, Pepsi kept winning. People said it was smoother, sweeter, and more refreshing. The numbers terrified Coca-Cola's leadership. They had built an empire on loyalty, and loyalty was slipping. So they decided to do the unthinkable. They would change the formula of the most famous drink in the world. In 1985, Coca-Cola announced it was replacing its original recipe with a new, sweeter version, one designed to beat Pepsi in blind tests. The company had invested millions in research, running over 200,000 taste comparisons. Consumers preferred the new formula. The data was clear. The science was perfect. The logic was flawless. But logic doesn't sell nostalgia. The day new Coke hit the shelves, the backlash began. People didn't just dislike the new taste, they hated it. Phone lines at Coca-Cola headquarters flooded with complaints. Letters poured in. Some even accused the company of betraying America itself. One man in Seattle started a movement called Old Cola Drinkers of America. Others began hoarding the last bottles of the original formula as if it were gold. Within weeks, Coke's brand, once untouchable, was burning. The problem wasn't chemistry. It was psychology. Coca-Cola hadn't just replaced a drink. It had replaced a memory. For nearly a century, Coke wasn't just about taste. It was about childhood, family, and comfort. When people opened a bottle, they were opening the past. And you can't rebrand nostalgia. Pepsi couldn't believe its luck. Their rival had done what Pepsi never could: destroy itself. Pepsi launched new ads celebrating the chaos. They mocked Coca-Cola for abandoning its own legacy. And sales soared. In April 1985, Pepsi became, for the first time in history, the #1 soft drink in America. The underdog had finally won. Executives at Pepsi called it the greatest day in the company's history. They threw parties. Employees toasted with cans of cola. Coca-Cola, the giant of giants, had fallen. But victories built on emotion rarely last. Because while Pepsi was celebrating, something unexpected was happening in the streets. People weren't just rejecting new Coke. They were fighting for the original. It became a movement, spontaneous, passionate, unstoppable. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Coke fans in revolt." Late-night comedians mocked the company's blunder. And suddenly, nostalgia turned into power. Coca-Cola had accidentally created the greatest marketing storm in history by losing control of its own myth. After just 79 days, Coca-Cola surrendered. On the 11th of July 1985, the company announced the return of its original formula, now called Coca-Cola Classic. Crowds cheered. News anchors treated it like a national victory. It was as if America had regained a lost piece of itself. And when the old Coke came back, sales didn't just recover, they skyrocketed. Within months, Coca-Cola reclaimed its throne. The brand that had nearly destroyed itself had become stronger than ever. Ironically, Pepsi's greatest victory had resurrected its rival. When Coca-Cola brought back its original formula, the world celebrated, but Pepsi was confused. How could they win the taste tests, dominate headlines, and still lose the war? The answer was simple and devastating. They had misunderstood what people were really buying. Coca-Cola's power was never about flavor, sweetness, or bubbles. It was about memory, about emotion, about identity. Pepsi had won the moment, but Coke owned the meaning. In the months that followed, Coca-Cola Classic outsold every other drink on Earth. The backlash had turned into free advertising worth billions. Even Pepsi executives admitted privately that Coke's comeback was a marketing miracle. One newspaper headline said it best: "Coca-Cola lost the battle but won the century." The cola wars weren't just about soda. They were about belief, the invisible force behind every brand, every purchase, every habit. Coke stood for consistency, tradition, and trust. Pepsi stood for energy, rebellion, and change. Both were right. Both were necessary. Because every generation rebels against the last, and every rebellion eventually becomes tradition. Coca-Cola and Pepsi were locked in a cycle that mirrored human nature itself. Pepsi's victory in 1985 proved that data can win battles, but emotion wins wars. You can't measure nostalgia in a lab or loyalty in a taste test. Once a brand becomes part of who people are, it stops being a product. It becomes a ritual. Coca-Cola learned that the hard way, by breaking its own spell. And Pepsi learned that being the challenger only works as long as there's someone left to challenge. After the chaos of the 1980s, both companies evolved. Coke leaned on its legacy, crafting campaigns around togetherness and memory. Pepsi doubled down on celebrity, youth, and pop culture. Michael Jackson, Britney Spears, Pepsi turned music into marketing. Coca-Cola turned nostalgia into an empire. Their rivalry shaped not just advertising, but modern psychology itself. Every brand since then has borrowed their tactics, selling not what a product does, but what it means. The Cola Wars taught the world that perception is reality, and that emotion is more powerful than logic. It was never just about what people preferred to drink. It was about who they wanted to be. And even today, the war continues quietly. Billions of cans sold, billions of choices made, each one a tiny vote in a century-long battle of identity. When you look at the Cola Wars from a distance, it's not a story about soda at all. It's a story about human psychology, belief, and belonging. Coca-Cola taught the world that a product could become a symbol. Pepsi taught it that even symbols can be challenged. One sold the past, the other sold the future. And both discovered the same truth, that emotion, not logic, rules the market. Because in the end, every brand sells a version of happiness. And happiness, like taste, is subjective. The Cola Wars didn't end with a winner. They ended with an understanding that the most valuable real estate in the world isn't shelf space, it's the human mind. So how did Pepsi outsmart Coca-Cola? By daring to question a legend, by forcing the giant to remember why it mattered. And how did Coca-Cola win in the end? By realizing that even in a world of data, formulas, and trends, the heart always chooses first. Because no matter what you drink, what you buy, or what you believe, the real war has never been between two colas. It's been between logic and emotion never loses for long.